It has long been said that passionate beginnings foment destructive ends, and Fëanor's hubris was to bring with it the fulfillment of this old adage as the First Age of Middle-earth came to an end. The sinking of Beleriand and the raising of Numenor from the darkest depths of the vast ocean bookended this forever altered Middle-earth. The Second Age of Middle-earth, in contrast to its precursor, began with a period of relative calm and prosperity. However, as was the recurrent theme in Tolkien's writings, a Dark Lord was soon to rise and bring with it a crushing end to such a peaceful epoch. In this video, we will detail the history of the Second Age, from the direct aftermath of Morgoth's downfall, right up to the usurpation of the role of Dark Lord by his former lieutenant Sauron, to the fall of Numenor. The earliest period of the Second Age was one dominated by efforts of construction and consolidation in the aftermath of the Great Sundering wrought by the War of Wrath. In the first year of the Second Age, the Grey Havens were founded, and the population looked to Círdan to lead them forward. Likewise, the Kingdom of Lindon was founded in that same year by Gil-galad, who ruled as the High King of all the elves who had not gone into the west following the defeat of Morgoth. The Noldor dwelt primarily within Forlindon, whereas the Sindar and those green elves who elected to remain in Middle-earth dwelt in Halindon, a fiefdom ruled by Celeborn. However, tensions still ran high amongst the elves of that time, as a number of the Sindar, who preferred not to live under the rule of Gil-galad and his Noldor, went east to live alongside the Sylvan elves, who were their Telerin kin. It is also likely that the surviving Edain resided alongside their elven counterparts until Numenor was raised from the watery depths. The Edain who may have dwelt here received great counsel and education from the Maya Eonwi prior to his return to the utter west, which was to benefit them immensely in their new kingdom. Of the Edain, the House of Beor had nearly been killed to a man in the gargantuan struggle they waged against the Dark Lord. Therefore, what remained of this once mighty clan merged with the Hadorians, and the unified group they assimilated into became the Númenóreans, under their first king, Elros, son of Eärendil, for the Valar had taken pity upon the Edain for their great suffering in a conflict which was never of their making. As a result, the Valar raised the island of Alenna from the depths of the ocean, and in return for their suffering, granted it to the Edain who had fought by their side during the War of Wrath. So it was that Elros, taking upon himself the name of Tar Minyatar, meaning High First King, led his people to Alenna, which was to be called Númenor in the year SA 32. The Númenóreans possessed far greater lifespans, physical prowess, and, at least in the earlier days of the kingdom's history, greater wisdom than those of the men who continued to dwell upon the shores of Middle-earth. However, the ban of the Valar continued to apply to the Númenóreans, in that they were forbidden from sailing so far westwards as to no longer be able to sight their fair isle. This ban was put in place to prevent the Edain from coming to the Undying Lands, a realm which men were forbidden from entering. This ban was strictly adhered to under the wise rule of the earliest kings of Númenor, for their respect and knowledge of the Valar following the close-won victory over Morgoth in the War of Wrath was substantial. The Dwarves were also substantially affected by the War of Wrath, as the cities of Belegost and Nogrod in the Blue Mountains were effectively ruined by the upheavals caused by the mighty struggle spearheaded by the Valar. This caused the denizens of these cities to begin to migrate in SA 40 to Khazad-dûm, the realm of Durin's folk, effectively abandoning the homes which had sheltered them through the tumultuous First Age. This influx of Broadbeams and Firebeards positively impacted the culture of Daradelv, as they brought with them a substantial number of fine smiths and artisans. The chronicler, however, does not detail whether the remaining clans remained separate and distinct in their new home, or if the groups were to effectively merge into a homogeneous Dwarven identity. As the Dwarves and Elves flourished upon Middle-earth proper, the kingdom raised by Ossi, established through the great works of Auli and enriched to its fullest by Yavanna, began to take shape. The Gardens of Númenor were subsequently brought into being by the Elves, who sought to reward their long-standing allies amongst the Edain. 4 flowers and fountains were brought out of the city of Avaloni upon the island of Tol Eressëa, serving to create a realm of men that Húrin, Tuor and Turin, among others, could only have dreamt of during their defiant struggles. The island garnered many names, for the Valar called it Andor, or the Land of the Gift, whereas its own people oftentimes referred to it as Westernesi, due to the fact that it lay furthest west of all the lands inhabited by mortals. Its culture was one which was easily identifiable, yet in many respects alien to its ancestors, who had gladly laid down such torrents of blood to ensure the survival of their descendants. For it could not be said to be a part of Middle-earth, yet at the same time, none could truly say that it was wholly separate from the land of their ancestors. The first king, Elros, was to provide a mark by which all others who came after were to compare themselves against. For, having turned down the immortality offered to him by the Valar, Elros Tarmanyauta came to the throne aged 90 in the mighty Númenórean capital of Armenelos. The blade Arenruth, which had once been sheathed at the side of Elros's great-great-grandfather, Thingol of Doriath, the ring of Barahir, and the axe of Tuor all became heirlooms of the kings of Númenor. Elros would also have 4 children throughout his 410-year reign, among them Vardamir Nolemon, Manwendil, Atenelkar, as well as his daughter Tindomiel, before passing in the year SA 442. Vardamir Nolemon was noted to be a scholar of exceptional talent, who despite his position as the eldest son of the king, desired not to rule, but only to continue his studies. Therefore, upon his father Elros's death, he accepted the crown of Númenor, only to immediately abdicate in favour of his eldest son Tar Amendil. As a result, he is considered to be the second king of Númenor due to his nominal 1-year reign, and would die in SA 471, aged 410. Tar Amendil, who accepted the kingship of Númenor due to his father's abdication, was therefore counted as the third king of Númenor. He had 3 children, Tar Elendil, Eärendor, and his daughter Mairen, in what was otherwise an unremarkable reign. The main reason his reign had been recorded as one of note in the annals of Númenorian history is due to events which occurred on the mainland unbeknownst to the king or his subjects. Sauron had begun to reassert himself in Middle-earth beginning in the year SA 500, when he began to develop the first tendrils of strength which would be required in order to assume his role as heir apparent to the legacy of the defeated Morgoth. A stark contrast to his previous cowering before the host of the Valar and begging at the feet of Eonwy, which caused him to flee and hide rather than face his judgment in the utter west. Tar Amendil surrendered the scepter of Númenor in the year SA 590, by which his eldest son, Tar Elendil, was to come to the throne. Tar Elendil's reign was more noteworthy than that of his predecessor, for the Númenorians during his kingship, being the fine mariners that they were, began to embark on great voyages from their fair isle. It was therefore in the year SA 600 that the captain of the king's ships, Viantor, led such a voyage to the mainland of Middle-earth for the first time in the history of Númenor. Upon landing, they discovered groups of men who spoke languages which, although related to the Númenorian tongue, differed greatly in what came to be known as Aduanic. After some deliberation, Númenorian scholars declared that this was due to the fact that these men were descendants of the fathers of the Edain. Known as the Atanatari, these men had not crossed over the Ered Luin and entered into Beleriand during the First Age, instead slowly migrating following the conclusion of the War of Wrath. Tar Elendil's succession also had some bearing over the future of the kingdom, as during his reign he had 3 children, the eldest daughter Silmarien, a middle daughter Isilmi, and the youngest son Irimon. Under the ordinary suppositions of full cognatic primogeniture, the throne should have passed to the eldest, Silmarien. However, this was not to be the case, as the laws of Númenor at the time followed the guiding principles of agnatic primogeniture, which effectively prevented women from ruling, and as a result, the eldest son yet youngest child assumed the kingship in SA 740, ruling as Tar Meneldur. Silmarien would then marry a nobleman of the vast port city of Andúnië called Elitan, and together they bore a child named Valendil, who became the first lord of Andúnië. It is from this lineage of Valandil's subsequent descendants that the lines of the exiled kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor trace their ancestors. It is also presumed that upon the succession, the blade Narsil, in conjunction with the Ring of Barahir, passed from father to daughter, eventually finding its way into the hands of a certain Aragorn, son of Arathorn. Tar Meneldur's reign was marked by further expansion of the Númenorian navy, exemplified by his son Aldarion establishing the Guild of Venturers to further such expeditions east. This guild would come to be one of the most powerful of all organizations on the island, as the Númenóreans continued to embrace their seafaring nature. During his reign, friendly relationships were established with the men of Middle-earth, who the Númenóreans called Middlemen, as opposed to their own identifier of Edain, or High Men. These diplomatic entreaties were supervised and supported by the Elves of Lindon, under Gil-galad's stewardship. A great many voyages were undertaken, which led to the first Númenórean settlements being established in Middle-earth. These temporary wayposts, unbeknownst to the mariners, would eventually become the core regions of the kingdoms in exile, Arnor and Gondor. These settlements also allowed greater contact with the Middlemen, with such interactions eventually causing the Aduanic language to merge with that of the Númenóreans, establishing Westron speech. Simultaneously, during the reign of Tar-Meneldur, the Kingdom of Eregion was founded by the Noldor in the year SA 750, where it was to be ruled by Galadriel and Celeborn from the capital Ostin-Ethil. This kingdom lay just outside the western gate of Khazad-dûm, and a firm friendship was soon established between the Noldor and Durin's folk, who were continuing to expand the subterranean kingdom as they continued to prosper from mining and trade. Thus it seemed that all the races of Middle-earth had found a prosperous peace for themselves in the aftermath of the devastating conclusion of the First Age. However, this was not to last, as a great evil had begun to arise once more in the east, one which would bring death and devastation once more to the free peoples. During the Second Age, Númenor prospered to such an extent that the race of man overtook the strength of the Eldar for the first time in the history of Middle-earth. Led by Aldarion, relations between elves and men continued to flourish, as Númenórean mariners traversed the continent at will. However, not all was well in Aldarion's personal life, as his devotion to the sea and travel caused a great rift in his marriage to Erendis, a tale which was to survive even the destruction of Númenor as Aldarion and Erendis, the mariner's wife. Under Aldarion's rule, the first Númenórean port upon mainland Middle-earth was established, when Vinalonde was constructed upon the river Gwathlo. To continue the expansion of the Númenórean fleets, the deforestation of the Enedwaith and Minhiriath was commenced, ensuring continued naval superiority for generations to come. Only a daughter was born to the king, Ancalami, so he changed the rules of succession. Agnatic primogeniture was replaced with equal primogeniture, allowing Ancalami to become the first queen of Númenor in the stead of her cousin Saronto, who had been heir presumptive at the time. However, even as Númenor was approaching the zenith of its power, the chief lieutenant of the Dark Lord Morgoth began to reveal himself. A new shadow arises in the east. It is no tyranny of evil men, as your son believes, but a servant of Morgoth is stirring, and evil things wake again. Each year it gains in strength, for most men are ripe to its purpose. Gil-galad in Aldarion and Erendis, the mariner's wife. Despite his inactivity in the earliest centuries of the New Age, Sauron had lost none of his malice and cunning. By SA 1000, he had gathered enough power to re-establish himself in the land of Mordor. Here he would build his seat, the great Barad-dûr, near the fiery pit of Mount Doom, and amass vast hosts of orcs, trolls, and many other creatures that had come to be through Morgoth's twisted machinations. Sauron was able to further twist the hearts of a number of the earliest nations of men, foremost among them the Easterlings and Haradrim, promising them wealth and power beyond their very reckoning in return for homage. Not long after the commencement of the construction of Barad-dûr, Tar-Ancalami came to the throne in SA 1075 as the first queen of Númenor, and the seventh ruler of that blessed isle. Her reign was dominated by the necessity of producing an heir for fear of the usurpation of her line by her cousin Saronto, which she was fortunately able to achieve through the birth of her son Anarion. It was during this period that Sauron made his first entreaties to the elves who had remained in Middle-earth. However, the wise High King Gil-galad initially saw through this ruse. Meanwhile, the Númenórean grip on Middle-earth was continually strengthened, as more permanent havens were constructed from SA 1200 onwards. including the haven at Lond-Dare. In SA 1350, the great elven leaders Celeborn and Galadriel left Eregion in favour of Lothlorien, with their daughter Celebrian in tow, which left Celebrimbor as the Lord of Eregion. This was to have devastating consequences, as in SA 1500, Sauron, in the guise of Anatar, who claimed to be a Maya come from Valinor and having previously served Orly, came to visit Eregion. He quickly befriended the great smiths of Eregion, foremost among them the lord of that land Celebrimbor, who had inherited much from his ancestor Fëanor. During his nearly 100-year-long stay in Eregion, Sauron mentored Celebrimbor and taught him much of the arts and magic, yet first and foremost of his teachings was of ring-making. It is in this way that Sauron deceived Celebrimbor into believing that forging the great rings of power might halt the decay of the world, which was felt most severely by the elves. During the period of forging, Barad-dûr was completed, and Glorfindel was once more reinstated to Middle-earth by Manwë, now bearing Maya levels of power. In total, 19 rings were forged by the elves, 16 of which Sauron, posing as Anatar, had a direct hand in. Yet the greatest three, bar the one secretly created in Middle-earth, were forged by Celebrimbor alone. The One Ring was forged by Sauron in the hopes that he would be able to control the elves who now bore them. However, as soon as the ruling ring was placed upon the Dark Lord's finger, the elves immediately became aware of his malicious influence and removed theirs. Sauron, furious at the failure of his plan, came against the elves with all the force available to him in the year SA 1693, in what came to be known as the War of the Elves and Sauron. Messages detailing the betrayal of Anatar, now revealed to be the lieutenant of Morgoth, Sauron, were immediately sent north to Lindon. There, the High King Gil-galad began to prepare what forces were immediately available to him, while also sending a missive to Númenor requesting aid. The war truly commenced in SA 1695, as Sauron's forces crossed the Fords of Isen and laid siege to Eregion. Celebrimbor, as Lord of Eregion, marshalled the defences of his land, while Elrond was sent at the head of a small army to reinforce the Forger of the Rings. However, the onslaught was such that by the time Elrond arrived at the capital of Ostinethil, the city had been razed to the ground, and Lord Celebrimbor lay amongst the fallen. The small force Elrond commanded, shocked to such an extent by the death of one of Fëanor's descendants at the hands of Sauron, was quickly routed. But then the dwarves of Khazad-dûm sallied forth to attack the Dark Lord's forces from the rear, which allowed the mauled elves a brief respite. Elrond engaged in a tactical retreat into the Misty Mountains, where he constructed a fortress within a secluded valley that came to be known as Rivendell in the years to come. The dwarves, meanwhile, retreated into Khazad-dûm, sealing the gates, aware that even at this stage their numbers were too few to contain the might of Mordor. At this stage, Sauron had recovered all of the rings, bar the 3 which had been given to the elves. In his planning of the campaign, their recovery was foremost within his mind as a result. The Dark Lord initially believed that all 3 were in the possession of the High King Gil-galad, when in fact he had retained only 2, so the brunt of the assault was to be focused upon his enemy of old. By the year SA 1699, the vicious assault of the vast hosts of Mordor had brought all of Eriador under Sauron's thumb, while a small force was sent to besiege Imladris and prevent Elrond from counter-attacking at the rear of the host. Further, the Grey Havens were besieged, and Lindon was entirely cut off from all aid, as Khazad-dûm and Rivendell would prove to be of little use in the battle that was to come. Yet hope came to Middle-earth once more from the west, when a vast Númenorian army was deployed upon the mainland for the first time in the history of that storied isle. Tar Minastir would not see his elven friends left to fight this battle alone, and sent a naval detachment under the command of Keyata to relieve Lindon. In these days, the average Númenorian stood on average 6 feet 4 inches tall, and was arrayed in the finest arms and armour available, which drew a stark contrast to the ill-shapen orcish hosts they were to face. Lindon was immediately relieved by the arrival of these mighty warriors and their capable commander, while further Númenorian contingents were landed at Tharbad on the Gwathlo and further south near Pelargir. Kieta, bolstered by Gil-galad and his elven swordsmen, pushed the hosts of Sauron further south in a continuous retreat, with massive casualties being sustained near Sarn's Ford, which unsuspectingly brought them to the Gwathlo. With a second Númenórean army blocking their retreat, the vast host of Mordor, composed mainly of cowardly orcs, was left with little chance but to stand and fight. The Battle of the Gwathlo, as it came to be known, was an utterly one-sided affair. Organised ranks of highly trained, disciplined and formidable Númenóreans, believed to number some 150,000 in total, provided both the hammer and anvil of this enterprise. The armies of Sauron were, therefore, utterly devastated at the hands of the men of the West, with a small contingent attempting to escape to the east of Calenathan. Unbeknownst to this desperate few, yet more Númenóreans were to descend upon them. The destruction of the host was so complete that Sauron was lucky simply to escape back to Mordor with naught more than a token bodyguard of the 600,000 he had brought forth to annihilate the elves. The elves under Gil-galad did not leave themselves idle either, marching upon the unsuspecting besiegers of Imladris and annihilating them with the aid of a sally from Elrond's survivors. Thus, the war of the elves and Sauron ended, with Sauron's might substantially destroyed to the point it would take him a full millennia to rebuild. However, the elves also suffered dearly in this war, as Eregion had ceased to exist, and Eriador was utterly devastated by the war which had been waged upon its soil. Sauron would swear revenge upon those who had dared to resist, bearing upon his already blackened soul a particularly grievous grudge upon the land of Númenor, which had utterly humbled him. Yet at this stage the Númenórean position seemed utterly unassailable, possessing a formidable and numerous force of warriors and mariners, and a base of operations that Sauron could not hope to reach. Such was their ascendancy at the zenith of the kingdom that permanent settlements continued to be established upon the mainland, which required naught more than a paltry garrison, for none amongst the peoples of that fair isle feared Sauron. Yet a healthy dose of fear may have saved the people of Númenor much suffering and woe, for what was to come would bring an end to their peaceful and prosperous existence for good and all. Although the intervention of the Númenóreans in the War of the Elves and Sauron marked the crowning achievement of Tar-Menastir's reign, it also represented the high watermark of Númenórean wisdom. For although Tar-Menastir's successor, Tar-Cíartan, was highly ambitious and expanded Númenor's power and wealth by orders of magnitude, the cracks in the facade had already begun to emerge. As the continued large-scale colonization of Middle-earth continued, it brought out the great greed which lay at the heart of man. The middle men of the mainland were effectively held as thralls of their Númenórean brethren, as they were forced to pay great tribute to their overlords. All the while, the treasury of the island realm grew increasingly full of rare metals and gems, which funded immense hosts of warriors and the construction of mighty armadas. However, it was the reign of Tar-Atanamir which marked the true departure of the Númenóreans from the wisdom which had so defined their realm up until this point. Tar-Atanamir would speak against the Valar, and in particular openly question the ban of the Valar and the necessity of the mortality of men. The Valar, perturbed by the conduct of the King of Númenor, sent ambassadors to soothe the rift which had begun to emerge. However, the king pithily asked them why his mighty forebears, Eärendil and Tuor, were determined worthy to live in Valinor until the breaking of the world, while mortal man was doomed to die. The ambassadors responded that his ancestors' fate was one apart from mortal man, and the Undying Lands were not capable in and of themselves of granting immortality, but were instead named such due to their inhabitants. The king was far from satisfied, and continued to argue against the love of the Valar and Elves which had long dominated Númenor, causing a schism within the Isle. Those who still loved the Elves and continued to receive them in secret became known as the Faithful, or Elendili, while many more came to resent their former allies. Perhaps the greatest indicator of Númenor's moral decline was evidenced within the succession, for Atanamir refused to abdicate, and became the first king to die while still strong in mind and body. The House of Elros, following on from this despotic and unwise reign, endured an ever-dwindling lifespan, and none again would renounce the scepter of Numenor, instead dying atop the throne. The division within Númenórean society was to become more pronounced and effectively irreparable under the reign of Tar Ancalamon. During this epoch, the Elendili who initially emerged in Atanamir's reign continued to advocate for devotion towards the Valar, who had rescued their ancestors from the tyranny of Morgoth, and maintaining the bonds of friendship long shared with the elves. In opposition, the king's men followed in the steps of their previous king by continuing to oppose the ban of the Valar and any form of friendship with the elves. Rather, they advocated for the independence and self-determination of Númenor, having witnessed the lofty position of the Isle amongst the denizens of Middle-earth. During the reign of Ancalamon, the elven tongues were openly discouraged and no longer taught to the children of the Isle. However, as a mark of respect for the ancient customs of their people, the royal titles were still taken in Quenya. However, this was not done out of any true love of the Eldar. Further, the great eagles, who had long nested within an eyrie above the king's palace in Armenelos, were no longer fed, and as such departed the island, never again to return. The rule of Ancalamon's son, Tar Telemaite, provided a direct continuation of his father's policies, with a particular emphasis placed upon obtaining Mithril and bringing it back to the island kingdom. Upon his death, his daughter, Tar Vanemeldi, assumed the throne. Tar Vanemeldi's reign was dominated by an indifference towards rulership. Rather than attending to matters of state, the queen favoured culture and arts, and left much of the business of ruling to her husband, a nobleman by the name of Herakelmo. Upon Varemeldi's death in SA 2637, the throne should have passed to her son Alcarin. However, as a symptom of the nation's decaying morality, Herakelmo usurped the throne. He would rule for 20 years as Tar Andukal. However, he was not considered legitimate, and no records of his rule persisted, with royal chroniclers recording that Vanemeldi's rule was immediately followed by Alcarin's. Tar Alcarin's reign, bar the impact of the usurpation, was mundane in the extreme. During his tenure, an uneasy peace persisted between the king's men and the faithful. However, as the ignorant opulence of the Númenóreans persisted, matters upon the mainland had begun to take a darker turn. Sauron's power had begun to grow exponentially, to the extent that the very mention of his name drove terror into the denizens of the lands which bordered Mordor. While Númenórean power spread throughout Middle-earth, with large settlements being constructed, such as Umbar in the south and the faithful-dominated Pelagia further north, Sauron's servants continued to multiply. It was in these days that the blind eye of Númenor allowed for the Nazgûl to appear and serve their lord in dark and despicable ways. Alcarin was succeeded by his son Tar Kelmikil, whose reign was barely noteworthy, apart from the fact that he became the first Númenórean king to record an Adunaic equivalent to his name. For in the Númenórean tongue, he was known to his subjects as Arbelzagar, which served to signify the continued alienation of the Númenóreans from their elven counterparts. Kelmikil was then succeeded by his son Tar Amadin, who was the last king of Númenor to take their name in Quenya. In private, his followers referred to him as Ar-Abatarik. Tar Adamin's son broke with this most ancient of traditions, rejecting the name Tar Herenumen in favour of the Adunaic Ar-Adunakor, forever ending the usage of Quenya names amongst the rulers of that fair isle. However, the name he chose was considered blasphemous in both languages by many, as it translated to Lord of the West, a title which was reserved for the King of the Valar, Manwë. During Ar-Adunakor's reign, the elven languages were no longer made use of, and nor were they taught to the children of the island. Consequently, boats from Tol Eressëa arrived ever more rarely, while the numbers of the faithful who continued the traditions of old and maintained secret friendships with the elves increasingly dwindled. This was due to the fact that the king had begun to persecute those amongst the faithful, actively punishing all those who openly spoke the elven tongues. The kings who followed would continue the policies which had come to dominate Númenórean politics, which led to a dramatic increase in the power of the king's men and increased persecution of the faithful. Under the reign of the 23rd king of Númenor, Al-Gimilzor, the use of the elven tongues was forbidden upon the island of Númenor. The White Tree was neglected, and the kings of Númenor would never again make a pilgrimage to the Hollow of Eru, despite protests from the Elendili for a return to the policies of old. So distrustful was the king that he moved the faithful from their ancestral home in the haven of Andunii to the secluded eastern edge of the island Romena, where a strict watch was placed upon them. However, in secret, his wife, Inzilbeth, counted herself amongst the faithful and taught her eldest child their ways. Inzilbeth was a descendant of the fourth king of Numenor, Tar Elendil, an aged and wise lineage. However, their second son, Gimilcad, rejected the teachings of his mother and older brother, instead coming to count himself amongst the king's men. Tar Palantir, which meant far-sighted, came to the throne in SA 3177, and also maintained the Adunaic name Arinzilidun, which meant the flower of the west. He had come to power at a time of great unrest and darkness, which swirled throughout the very fabric of Númenórean society, threatening to engulf it long before the tides ever rose around that fair and storied island. In contrast to his predecessors, who had long since turned from the light of the Valar to focus upon their insatiable greed and the need to create an empire upon the shores of Middle-earth, Tar Palantir sought to save his people from damnation. Tar Palantir repented for the sins of the now deceased kings, taking his name in Quenya, tending once more to the White Tree, and honouring Eru Iluvatar, using the long-neglected ancient practices of earlier kings. Despite this, no response came from the Valar, and the view of Tel Eressëa from the Tower of Tar Minastir remained shrouded. As such, unrest became the defining factor of Tar Palantir's reign, and would also define his succession. Yet even amongst his staunchest enemies and detractors, Tar Palantir was recognised as a peerless seer, who rightly prophesied that the fate which was to befall the White Tree of Nimloth was tied irretractably to that of the House of Elros. Tar Palantir's daughter, Tar Miriel, sought to continue this reconciliation, having inherited her father's great wisdom and love of the elves. Alas, this was not meant to be, for in SA 3255, her throne was usurped by her cousin, Ar-Pharazôn, who married Miriel against her will and renamed her Ar-Zimrafel, or High Jewel Daughter. Ar-Pharazôn was the son of Gimilcad, who had led the faction of the king's men during the reign of Tar Palantir. His pride, in conjunction with the teachings of the king's men, would lead him far and wide, wherein he would win much renown as a captain of men through the wars waged against the middlemen. His decision to wed his cousin against Númenórean law and usurp her throne was a direct byproduct of his ever-escalating pride, and he would wield his power with an iron fist. Initially, he persecuted what remained of the faithful. However, his attention was soon drawn to the mainland, as Sauron had begun to call himself the Lord of Men, which necessitated the coming of the King of Númenor to Middle-earth once more. By the time the rule of Ar-Pharazôn misguidedly came to be, the Second Age of Middle-earth had found itself in an era of intense uncertainty. Although Sauron had once more been able to raise great armies and establish himself as the Lord of Mordor, his status was little more than that of a paper tiger. Moreover, while the elves remained a formidable force in and of themselves within the waning days of the Second Age, they could still be overwhelmed by the vast tide of orcs which Sauron could draw to his side. However, if Sauron had engaged in such an assault, the Númenóreans would be obliged to intervene, not for their love of the elves, a love which had long since withered, but due to their inherent sense of superiority. The Númenóreans could brook no challenge to their might. Such was the intensity of their arrogance that should Sauron reach out to crush their long-deserted allies, they would come in such might so as to render resistance moot. This uneasy stalemate was to come to a sudden end with the coming of the mightiest army of the Edain which had ever and would ever be assembled. As the Dark Lord had begun to assume further titles which he believed would befit the station of a being of his majesty and splendour. Amongst these newfound titles were the Lord of the Earth and King of Men. These were mere titles and meaningless words, yet their impact upon the continent of Middle-earth was as momentous as the waves which sunk Beleriand in the end. Ar-Pharazôn had been described as a man of great beauty and stature after the image of the first kings, indeed in his youth not unlike the Edain of old in mind also. Although he may have looked every inch a king, he lacked that very essence of what it meant to be a true ruler, and for this his people would suffer dearly. Therefore, upon hearing that another bore such titles in direct opposition to his own rule, combined with the attacks Sauron had begun to launch upon Númenórean settlements upon the coast of Middle-earth, the king lurched unsteadily into action. Although the chronicler does not detail the actual numbers involved in the maritime landings of the Númenóreans, the sheer might of the army of men was truly astonishing. For as Ar-Pharazôn crested upon Middle-earth's shores in Umbar in SA 3261, at the head of the Númenórean host, he gazed upon Mordor, truly confident that there was no other possible outcome but that of a Númenórean triumph. The Edain soon departed the harbour city and made toward the plains of Gorgoroth. Yet unlike their ancestors in the Battle of the Gwylltho, no great battles were to be fought, and no honour in battle was to be won. When Sauron's blighted hordes beheld the size of the force arrayed against them, the Dark Lord's armies simply abandoned him, unwilling to be annihilated at the hands of the mightiest warriors of their age. As such, Ar-Pharazôn was able to simply walk into Mordor, allowing Sauron to truly comprehend the true strengths and weaknesses of the race of men. For rather than flee from their might once more in the hopes he could build a force capable of matching the might of Númenor in the field, Sauron now knew that Númenor's demise must come from within that fair isle rather than without. To that end, the successor of Morgoth allowed himself to be captured, throwing himself at the feet of the King of Númenor and begging forgiveness. Had it been the king's predecessor, the wise seer Tar Palantir, the Dark Lord may have been slain in that moment. But Ar-Pharazôn was a man who was deficient in foresight and abundant in arrogance. Such was his hubris, his unshakable belief in his own power and supposed wisdom, that he thought that in that instant that he could now contend with a Maiar and shackle him in some lowly cell upon his island home. As a result, Sauron was brought to Númenor in chains, which led many within the king's court to believe that the great foe of the race of man had been laid low. Although Sauron was to initially feign his unhappiness at this development, he secretly delighted in his own cunning, now believing victory was all but assured. After a mere handful of years, Sauron's cunning and intense charisma allowed him to rise from a lowly prisoner within the dark pits of Númenor to an advisor at the right hand of the king. Such was his influence upon the courts of Ar-Pharazôn that in the kingdom founded by Elros Half-Elven himself, it was not long before many within the court were openly worshipping the previous Dark Lord Morgoth. It is he whose name is not now spoken, for the Valar have deceived you concerning him, putting forward the name of Eru, a phantom devised in the folly of their hearts, seeking to enchain men in servitude to themselves. For they are the oracle of this Eru, which speaks only what they will. But he that is their master shall yet prevail, and he will deliver you from this phantom, and his name is Melkor, Lord of all, giver of freedom, and he shall make you stronger than they. Sauron to Ar-Pharazôn. In spite of the corruption which lay at the festering heart of what had once been a kingdom and a people of such purity of purpose, the island prospered. However, this prosperity came at a dreadful cost. As the hearts of the people of Númenor were internally poisoned, their outward actions began to reflect this taint. The middlemen, who had once been treated as long-lost kinsmen, if never of the same station as that of the Númenóreans, were hunted, captured and enslaved. Many were brought to Númenor in chains, not unlike Sauron had once been carried to the island. Yet their end was far more cruel, for many were slain with the utmost indignity as sacrifices to Morgoth. The symbolic, moral destruction of the kingdom came with the felling of the beautiful white tree of Nimloth, whose lumber was used to christen the mighty temple of Morgoth with a pyre of unholy flame. This structure, which Sauron had raised within the very heart of the capital of Armenelos, emphasized the dark descent of these days, for it was mighty in form, yet rotten to the very core of its intent. The temple was composed of a mighty dome, 500 feet across and 500 feet high, with walls 50 feet thick at the base. Although the roof of the dome was covered with a glorious silver facade, this quickly charred and blackened due to the smoke of the ritualistic rites, evidencing in microcosm the moral decay and decline of Númenor. The chorus of screams which oft emerged from its lofty interior were an intermingling of the human sacrifice of middle men and the faithful alike, at the decree of its high priest Sauron. The Lord of Andúniu in these days, Amandil, recognized the vast corruption within the very being of his people, and as such withdrew to Romenna. This last bastion of the faithful had become a fearful backwater, due to the ongoing persecution of those who now dwelt there, begun years earlier, and intensified under the callous cruelty of Sauron. This persecution was to intensify, as the spectre of death loomed ever larger upon the arrogant Ar-Pharazôn. As time passed, Ar-Pharazôn leaned more and more heavily on the advice of his immortal counselor Sauron, who advised the monarch to make war upon the Valar themselves and seize the immortality he so desired. Consequently, a mighty fleet was assembled over a period of 9 years in order to steal for mankind the immortality which it had never been intended to possess. However, Amandil had become aware of the plans of his foolish liege and spoke with his son Elendil, seeking counsel from him. The final course he deliberated upon was to take the route of his ancestor Eärendil and beg for the forgiveness of the Valar in person. As such, he engaged in a ruse whereby he and 3 close servants sailed east as if they were making their way to the coast of Middle-earth, before altering their course. The ship would then head west, so Amandil could potentially save his home from the great downfall which now awaited it. In the end, this journey came to naught, for Amandil and his ship were never seen nor heard from again. As a result, Elendil assumed the leadership of the faithful, and prepared his people so that they could survive the doom which now awaited them. Just prior to this immense undertaking, the dome of the great Temple of Morgoth was cracked as lightning unleashed by Eru himself came down upon the temple. However, the Dark Lord remained unbowed before such a show of might, and placed himself upon the top of the dome, defying the lightning, defying Eru, and in the eyes of his followers becoming a god. By SA 3319, the Great Armament, as it had become known, was readied, and Ar-Pharazôn boarded his flagship, Alcarandas, and the fleet departed. After braving the cruel seas, the host landed upon the shore of Aman, making their camp upon the green hillock of Tuna, which inspired great fear in the Valar, who now worried for the safety of the Valinor. However, the Valar were forbidden from killing the men who had now invaded their shores, nor could they bring to bear any form of force. As such, Manwë, the chief of the Valar, called upon Eru Ilúvatar to bring relief to the denizens of the Undying Lands. Ilúvatar duly answered, opening up a great chasm in the sea between Númenor and Aman, which swallowed the Great Armament, entrapping them within the Caves of the Forgotten, where they would remain until called upon during the Dagor Dagorath. Númenor itself was subsequently drowned in the great wave caused by the opening of the Abyss, which also destroyed the body of Sauron, depriving him of the ability to assume a fair form ever again. Ilúvatar would go on to break the world, changing it once more, turning Arda from a flat to a round shape, and removing Aman and Tol Eressëa from the world forever, so no mortal sailor could ever reach the true west for the final declining days of Middle-earth. Yet hope remained, as not all of the citizens of Númenor were lost to the flood. 9 ships of the Númenorian faithful were able to flee to Middle-earth, and they were led by Elendil and his 2 sons Isildur and Anarion. When their forces were separated, the majority of the contingent landed in the south, and would form the Kingdom of Gondor, with the remaining ships landing in the north of the continent to create the Kingdom of Arnor. The survivors merged with the remaining Númenorians who had colonized the regions in question during the apex of Númenorian power. Sauron also survived the downfall of Númenor, although his strength was much reduced. He was able to flee to Mordor and retain the One Ring. The 2 Númenorian nations in exile were linked with the King of Arnor holding the title of High King and maintaining ascendancy over their Gondorian counterparts. 2 fortresses were built in the region of Gondor to act as a bulwark against Mordor, Minas Ithil and Minas Tirith. In the meantime, Sauron had finally regained enough of his strength in order to take physical form. Becoming aware of the newly established exile kingdoms, he quickly took action to destroy them. In 3429, his armies attacked Gondor rapidly, besieging Minas Ithil and the capital of Gondor, Osgiliath. Minas Ithil was lost soon after, as the city's defenders were overwhelmed by the Orcish numbers, who took the city with relative ease. While Anarion held the line in Osgiliath with the force that he had hastily assembled, Isildur rushed north to inform his father, Elendil, of the attack. Anarion was successful in repelling the invasion force and sending them fleeing into the woods of Ithilien. Taking counsel with the elven leaders, the last alliance of men and elves was formed, with Elendil and Gil-galad providing leadership for each of their races respectively. 2 years were spent raising sufficient forces in order to match the hordes of orcs that the Dark Lord could bring to bear. Their forces amassed at the watchtower of Amon Sul at Weathertop, before moving to Rivendell and joining with the forces of Elrond there. From here, the Great Alliance crossed the Misty Mountains, and were joined by contingents of elves from Mirkwood and Lorien, as well as an army of dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and the army of Gondor led by Anarion, fresh from pushing back the assault on Osgiliath. With this, the war was joined, and the alliance seemed poised to end the influence of the Dark Lord upon Middle-earth for good and all. Such was the might of the great host that it would remind the likes of Elrond of the great War of Wrath itself. I remember well the splendour of their banners. It recalled to me the glory of the elder days and the hosts of Beleriand. So many great princes and captains were assembled, and yet not so many, nor so fair, as when Thangorodrim was broken, and the elves deemed that evil was ended forever, and it was not so. The first pitched battle took place at the plains of Dagorlad, outside of Mordor, in the year 3434, with supreme command of the Alliance forces being granted to Gil-galad. However, this grant of command triggered the arrogance of the elves, namely that of the kings of Mirkwood and Lorien, Oropher and Amdir respectively. As both forces deployed their formations, one of the main advantages the last alliance possessed was their cohesion and discipline, for which the elven swordsmen in particular were famed far and wide. Yet the two aforementioned kings, angered by Gil-galad's command, broke formation and charged wildly at the immense force of orcs and foul beasts, attempting to garner fame and fortune by their exploits. Despite making early gains and driving the orcs back by the sheer force of their strength at arms, the numbers and sheer brutality of their foe soon led to casualties among the elves. Before long, the elves who had foolishly charged into the forces of the Dark Lord were pushed back, leaving the fate of the battle on a knife's edge. His plan disrupted by the folly of his comrades, Gil-galad acted decisively, supporting the errant elven contingent with the weight of the entirety of what the free peoples of Middle-earth could muster. The leadership of Gil-galad ultimately saved the day, and the war effort as a whole, as the forces of Sauron were decisively beaten, leaving the Dark Lord on the back foot for the remainder of the war. Yet this battle was as costly as they come, with Amdir, Oropher, and a vast contingent of Mirkwood and Lorien forces lost due to the folly of the two kings. This left the area permanently scarred by the mass of human, elven, dwarven, and orcish casualties, which now blighted the landscape, forever transforming the region into the Dead Marshes, an area avoided by all but the most desperate. Thranduil and Amroth would take the titles of Kings of Lorien and Mirkwood from their slain fathers respectively. Taking little time to regroup, Gil-galad sensed the golden opportunity which now beckoned, and following the counsel of the other leaders of the alliance, Elendil and Elrond chief among them, a decision was taken. The Black Gates were besieged, and soon breached due to the sheer might of the force which now moved even further into Mordor, defeating each force which Sauron sent to face them. While ultimate success was not yet guaranteed, the forces of man, elf and dwarf were buoyed by each victory, and with their morale soaring, their greatest challenge now loomed before them. Despite severe losses, they maintained an advantage, which prevented this war of attrition in a plateau to the north of Mordor called Udun from halting their progress. For, with the two mightiest warriors of their day at the head of the host, it seemed that little could stop the last alliance from achieving its final purpose. For it was oft said that, against Aeglos, the spear of Gil-galad none could stand, and the sword of Elendil filled orcs and men with fear, for it shone with the light of the sun and of the moon, and it was named Narsil. Yet against the imposing fortifications of Barad-dûr, shining swords and spearheads could accomplish little. Initially, attempts were made to storm Barad-dûr, but this failed almost immediately due to the immense fortifications which Sauron had erected in order to prepare for just such a situation. The fortress was created by the dark magic of Sauron, which held it together, and was composed of battlement after battlement and had taken close to 600 years to construct, and was without any shadow of a doubt the greatest fortress in Middle-earth. The sight of it drove fear into the besiegers, and cast doubt upon their ability to seize the victory they so desperately required to end the threat posed to all those who resided within the free realms of Middle-earth. This fortress was also bound to the One Ring, and as long as the ring persisted, it would remain impossible to fully destroy it, adding to the mounting logistical complications which such a siege could pose to Gil-galad and Elendil. The siege would go on for 7 years, with massive casualties dealt to the forces of the last alliance. Countless sorties of orcs were sent out to drive back the besiegers, which when combined with the volleys of arrows, boulders, and missiles of the flaming variety that constantly harassed the attackers, threatened to decimate the alliance forces. In the 6th year of the siege, tragedy struck the line of Elendil as Anarion was hit by a missile fired from the walls of Barad-dûr in the head and was killed instantly. His death caused many woes among the Númenóreans, who mourned his valor and competent leadership. This, however, increased the determination of the race of men to secure their future in those fiery plains. A year later, Sauron and his forces sallied forth in an attempt to bring an end to the conflict and finish the siege and the last alliance with it. Rows of elven swordsmen who made up the flower of the host held the centre, alongside the most experienced and battle-hardened of the Númenóreans, with dwarven contingents supporting the remaining warriors of Gondor and Arnor on the flanks. Elrond and Gil-galad held command of the centre, with Elendil and Isildur commanding their own respective forces. The blood of Númenor still flowed freely through the forces of man at this stage in the exile, and as such, these warriors remained exceptionally competent and unyielding in the face of the overwhelming Orcish onslaught. Despite their prowess in battle, however, the forces of the last alliance remained outnumbered. The forces of Mordor surged forward in a tide bereft of any true tactics. They attempted to use the weight of their numerical advantage to overwhelm the organized and tactically astute battle lines assembled before them. While their weapons and armor were deficient in comparison to those of their opponents, their ferocity and crazed devotion to their Dark Lord were not to be scoffed at. The battle was joined when the Orcish host met the elven swordsmen in the centre, their forces having been thinned out by the overwhelmingly accurate volleys of arrows unleashed by the elven archers. The lines held as the warriors of the last alliance refused to grant their opponents an inch, as the famed discipline of Noldor was able to keep the Orcish host at bay. Despite the increasing pressure which was placed upon their lines, this stalemate was maintained, with massive casualties inflicted on both sides. As the battle progressed, the last alliance began to gain the advantage, standing as a cliff before the oncoming tide. The morale of the Orcish rabble began to falter, and it seemed that victory now was within the grasp of Gil-galad and Elendil. It was at this point that Sauron, in his physical form of a towering warrior, clad in plate armor from head to toe and wielding a mace alongside the One Ring, entered the fray. Making for the center of the alliance formation, he soon made light work of the valiant warriors who had held his servants at bay for so long. Seeing that their lines might now break, Gil-galad and Elendil dueled Sauron, who had not reached his full strength yet, on the broken plains of Mordor, displaying the great valor inherent within their people, proving to be a match for the Dark Lord. As the battle raged around them, the two great leaders of the last alliance mortally wounded Sauron, but paid a heavy price for their courage. Gil-galad was cast down with the heat of Sauron's armored hand, and Elendil was likewise struck down by the Maiar, who was wounded in the process. The sheer weight of the blow drove Sauron from his physical form, causing him to take on his ethereal aspect, and his disappearance sent his entire army into a rout. In the aftermath, Isildur, who came upon the corpses of the great leaders of the Alliance, was heartbroken by the loss of his father. He took up the shattered remnant of Narsil and strode towards the ailing Maiar. Bending down, Isildur cut off the armoured finger which held the One Ring, and claimed it as his own weregild. Sauron's spirit fled his physical form. Narsil, however, would live long in the memory of the Dark Lord, and he would forever bear an unequivocal hatred for the line of kings of the Númenórean exiles. In spite of this crushing blow to the Dark Lord, however, he was not wholly defeated, as the ring, and with it his being and malice, was to persist. Elrond of Rivendell confirmed it. "Fruitless did I call the victory of the last alliance? Not wholly so, yet it did not achieve its end." The defeat of Sauron would usher in the Third Age of Middle-earth, and set the scene for his ultimate return and the War of the Ring, which would forever change the fate of Middle-earth and all who resided within it. This draws to a close our series on the Second Age of Middle-earth, an era dominated by the very best and worst of what the race of man had to offer the world. However, even in spite of their inherent failings and inability to grasp the lesser aspects of their nature, the race of man was to bring with them into the Third Age an unwillingness to bend before the darkness of their time. Even if they continued this struggle in the absence of hope, and with the decline of their fortunes all too evident to those capable of bearing witness to the world at large, how therefore could they prevail in spite of all this doom and gloom? In order to answer this question, we recommend that you rewatch our series depicting the War of the Ring and the Third Age more broadly. But right now, we're planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We will try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.